Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're still discussing the mystery of the Sodder children. In 1945, on Christmas Eve, there was a house fire in Fayetteville, West Virginia that left a family missing five of their children, no physical remains ever discovered. This is the third installment in the kind of new series that I'm doing on them, and I would hope that everyone can listen to parts 1 and 2, but we're going to talk about some very theoretical things in this third part here. In the second part of this mystery, we mentioned that there was a photograph that was mailed to the Sodder family in 1967. We're talking 22 years after the house fire. Once again, there were five children that went missing, and I need to correct myself from the previous installments. I made a comment once that Louis Sodder was the youngest of the children at age 9 years old when the fire happened, but in reality, Betty Sodder was the youngest, and she was 6, if I believe, and Louis was actually 10. So, as I mentioned, though, I covered this case a lot in 2015 before I ever had any sort of YouTube channel, so I was a little rusty on my details, but I've been refreshing, and yes, Betty Sodder was the youngest at age 6. But anyway, let's get back to the kind of case that we're dealing with today. In 1967, they received a letter that contained a photograph of a man who was most likely in his early 30s. And on the back of this letter, it said, Louis Sodder, and I love Brother Frankie, LLIL Boys, BOIS, and then A90132 or 35. I mentioned a little bit of this at the end of the last recording, but I really felt that there is some sort of mystery associated with that. I mean, to be honest, I feel like that's a cryptic message. I feel that this is a cryptic message. Well, who sent it, and what does this photograph mean, and what does this inscription on the back mean? Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, and this is one of those things where I just couldn't sleep, so I just had to talk about it. Alright, so this was mailed from Central City, Kentucky. Now, we had an earlier sighting of Louis Sodder in Texas, so we also had a confession from a man, in that from that same sighting that both Louis Sodder and Maurice Sodder were in Texas. I mean, to be more precise, what the man said was he became very intoxicated at a bar, and he confessed to a woman that he was living in Texas with his brother, which we can only interpret to be Maurice Sodder. But what does the photograph exactly mean? Well, the second line is, I love Brother Frankie, and I probably sound like a giant rambling mess right now, so let's just get to the heart of the issue. You'll have to excuse me for, being a little bit jumbled, but I believe that this was mailed from Central City, Kentucky. That means that Louis is in Texas. I don't think Louis Sodder mailed the photograph. I believe that this was mailed by one of his sisters. And what I tried to say was the man in Texas who confessed to being Louis Sodder only mentioned having a brother. He didn't mention having any sisters. So it is my interpretation that in Central City, Kentucky, one of the Sodder sisters was living there. I mean, it's very normal. Perhaps she got married. Perhaps she just wasn't living with her brothers anymore. They would have all been adults. I mean, even Betty Sodder would have been an adult, and if this would have happened, we're talking 22 years later, she would have been 28 or 29, depending on her birthday. So I believe one of the sisters mailed this to the family. I believe that they just wanted to share something, and they also thought of a way that they could disguise the setup. But what is the second line? I love Brother Frankie. I thought of two possibilities. During the previous recording I mentioned, I thought that Frankie was the person who had taken care of them. Perhaps, they were taken away and then they were actually sent to Italy for a while, because the last part is a zip code, postal code for a place in Sicily, and I believe both of them are A90132 or 35 are both actual postal codes in Sicily. But then we have I love Brother Frankie. I also thought of the possibility that since this is his sister mailing the photograph, perhaps Louis was under a new name. Maybe she was trying to say that either Louis or Maurice was now using the name Frankie. And yes, I mean, like, I do have, you have to really understand, this is something theoretical. I'm not a mind reader. I can't, say anything with 100% certainty, but it was a possibility that I entertained. First line, Louis Sodder. Second line, I love Brother Frankie. It could either mean that Louis's brother is going by Frankie, being Maurice, or that Louis has now using the name Frankie. And once again, this is his sister mailing it, because as the only sighting of Louis that we have is in Texas, and this was mailed from Kentucky. Now the next line, Lil Boys, this is the one that just racked my mind, L-L-I-L. If this were just spelled L-I-L, I would have just assumed that that meant little boys, like, you last saw Louis when he was a little boy or something. But that's not exactly the case. I mean, that that four-letter combination really stood out to me. That four-letter combination, just like, that's the reason I can't sleep tonight. I was like, what on earth is that? Is that somebody who just got a little quick with a pen and they misspelled a word? Well, in those days, I mean, we didn't have text messages or email, so you can't just correct it. I mean, but maybe they just didn't notice or something. Well, I was really trying to figure out, what does that mean? I mean, I used to think that that there are two L's, and then there's an I, and then there's a third L. You're meant to pay attention to the third place marking. And was like, what could that possibly be? I was just like, maybe the third person in their group had passed away. Or I also thought that perhaps they were trying to say that Maurice and Louis were now with two other boys, and that would mean two other males, two other men, that Maurice and Louis are now in Texas with two other guys, and that Louis is the third oldest one. I mean, once again, name Louis Sodder. He is now going by the name Frankie, and Louis is the third oldest boy in this group. And then, why is there a zip code for Sicily? Well, I really interpret that to mean that they were taken to Sicily, and that they probably stayed with people who were in these zip codes, A901232 or 35. I mean, they probably spent some time in both of those places in Sicily. I understand that this is theoretical, but I was really trying to figure out what this means. Now, why would somebody send a cryptic message as opposed to just saying, hey, this is Louis Sodder, he's in Texas? Well, once again, I mean, if we're going to entertain any theory that the Sodder children are still alive, that would mean that somebody took them away. And what almost all parties who entertain that theory is that they were under strict orders not to contact their families, not to return to West Virginia, not to reach out in any way. The mafia could have been involved. They could have been under threats, like, if you ever contact your family again, they will all die or something. Just do what we tell you. Something very horrific. Like, it is possible. And that's not only coming from me, that is coming from, the family itself and an enormous amount of people on the internet. Excuse me. But it's like, we really have to recognize the family stood out with this until their dying days. They were just like, they believed that their children and their brothers and sisters survived that fire. And I do have to admit that it's horribly shocking that all 5 bodies were reduced to ash 100%. I could understand even 3 bodies being reduced to ash, but you would find probably at least one bone fragment of somebody, right? Well, that didn't happen. That never happened. So that really opens up this very large possibility that they did indeed survive the fire. They were taken away from someone in just, the commotion and the shock. And then the people that took them away gave them strict orders never to contact their families again. And we have that zip code there for a place in Sicily. So leads us to believe that these were children who were taken out of the house. And at this point, I don't think it's too. I think it's very, very difficult to speculate who. I mean, I would be much more concerned with the question of were the children alive and where did they end up? Most likely, I mean, like I'm saying, I believe that they were taken to Italy for a while, then they came back under different names. And that really could be something that, that is trying to say. His name is Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie, would mean that one of the two boys, Maurice or Louis, is going by the name Frankie now. And, it's like, I really just thought there was some kind of meaning in those four letters, LLIL. I wanted to say that Louis was the third oldest in that group of boys, because of course, over a period of 22 years, of course, they're going to be with more individuals. Or perhaps, like, I wasn't even really sure about sharing the next thing I'm going to say because it's even super theoretical. I thought that maybe one of the children had died, and that's why there are four L's, and that's why there are four letters and not five. I almost thought that was a place marker, and that would just sort of mean that one of the children had passed away, but and Lewis would be the third oldest in that group. That's why that is marked. But look at that, LLIL, or even if you interpret it as a different letter combination, you're meant to draw attention to the third letter. It's saying something with the number 3. So I really just thought about that, but I wasn't sure about saying it because it's a super theoretical thing where it's like maybe one of the children, maybe it was even Betty that passed away, and that Louis was the third oldest in the group now because Betty had passed away, so that Louis Sodder in that photograph, who's now using the name Frankie, is still alive, and that they were in Sicily for a while. I mean, there is the possibility, though, that the numbers A90132 or 35 is actually saying age 32 or 35 once you look at it from a cursive script, and that someone has, transcribed it incorrectly. That possibility has always stayed with me, and because at the time, Louis Sodder should have been 31 years old, 31 or 32. I'm said 31 because I thought he was 9 at the time of the fire, but I was just looking at something on the internet that was saying that he was 10, so yes, that indeed would have made him 32 at the age of the fire. I don't know why it would say or 35. I mean, once again, though, it's like there were only two boys in the group, Maurice and Louis. There was no Frankie. So I'm really just going with either one of those two possibilities, that Frankie was either someone that, became a new family member to them, or that Louis or Maurice was now using the name Frankie, and that this photograph was mailed by one of the sisters who was no longer living with them. She was in Kentucky. Maybe the boys, Maurice and Louis, were now in Texas, and that she wanted to say that I love Brother Frankie, meaning that this is my brother, but he is now going by Frankie. Betty has passed away, so this is the third guy in the group. He is the third oldest, or he is the third something. But there are 5 children, not 4, and there are only 4 letters. And there it says boys. I don't know, I'm really torn about that. I'm really torn because I really think there is a message there, because even if it's just a symbol, even if it's just, an abbreviation, everything else is spelled correctly. Everything else is something that, is understandable. I love Brother Frankie. I mean, you can comprehend that sentence. But just 4 letters, LLIL, I mean, that's really trying to say something, trying to say something. There's a message in that. And then, the zip codes for Italy, I don't necessarily know what else that could be other than age 32 or 35. Well, I mean, I want to keep an open mind with this, and I would love to hear what some other people have to say. If anyone has ever followed the case of the Sodder children And if you've ever heard my two previous uploads on this, part 1 and part 2, I would love to hear some more things from other people. And I think that maybe by discussing some of what we have, put forward here on this upload, I hope that really could get some answers. Also, you might be wondering what would be the motivation to send that cryptic message. Well, it's just like, I think that perhaps one of the girls just wanted to reach out to the family, and she probably had debated on how to do that for a long time, and then she just thought, what is the way that I can reach out to the family to let them know that I'm okay, or to let them know that, the children survived the fire, without ever getting it drawn back to her, without ever getting it drawn back to them. It's like, I mean, even like, as I say these things out loud, I'm just wrestling with it inside, I'm just like, I can get to the first line, what that means. That means that that's Louis Sodder. And the second line, I love Brother Frankie. I sound like a broken record, but that would either mean that Frankie was the person taking care of them, or that Frankie was an alias that either Maurice or Louis was using. And there are 4 letters, and you're meant to pay attention to the third letter. So it's saying the third something. And, it could be either that Betty, the youngest, passed away, and that there are only 4 children now. Louis is the third one in this group. Or if the word boys at the end, that might also mean that, Maurice and Louis were together in Texas with a group of 2 other boys, so there are 4 boys, and Louis is the third. That's why he's in this photograph. I mean, that's all going off of the sighting in Texas. I mentioned on the second segment of the podcast that I really found that the sighting of Louis in Texas was the most genuine sighting of the Sodder children, because a lot of the other ones were based a lot on assumptions, and I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't know, it wasn't a crazy story. It was just like some guy got intoxicated and confessed to being Louis Sodder, and the woman who contacted George Sodder thought it was serious enough to reach out, and it was just like, well, I mean, I better tell somebody, I better find out who this George Sodder guy is and tell him where his son is. I mean, she obviously felt the need to contact him, and unless that was just some sort of vicious prank, or that guy just got really drunk and started talking about a news story that he heard, I mean, people do things like that. I'm fully aware. I mean, there are hoaxes out there, and there also are just, people who start saying things when they're intoxicated that they don't really mean. I don't even know why you would question their motivations. I mean, he was drunk and he said something that wasn't true. I mean, that's possible. I'm well aware of that, and, it's a mystery for a reason, because we don't have all the answers. But what we do have is, we have a photograph that arrived in 1967, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. First line, Louis Sodder. That means that Louis is the person in the photograph. Second line, I love Brother Frankie. Either Louis is now going by Frankie, Maurice is going by Frankie, or someone else has been absorbed into their family, that they've been staying with this person all this time, like, that this person was either taking care of them, that he was someone close to Louis's age, someone that he grew up with, he was like a new brother to them, and that, there are now 4 people in this group, and, it's like, I don't know, the problem that I have with my theory is that I'm almost feels like I'm taking the Texas angle and the Italy angle and combining them too roughly. I would really feel like they would have given, something about the state of Texas if they were trying to tell them that Louis was living in Texas. I mean, like, only if they were trying to say that Frankie was the person that cared for them when they were in Italy. That's why the zip codes are there from Sicily. I mean, maybe it could be that, and I really want to try and get as close to the truth as possible, and I believe that, if we start talking about it in the comments section, perhaps we can actually get to that level where we can actually sort of recognize this is possible, or this is impossible. And I do believe that. I mean, I believe that we can solve that, between what I put out here and discussing this in the comments section. So let's look at that as probably the largest angle, that this is Louis Sodder in the photograph. Frankie was someone who took care of them when they were in Italy. Frankie was, someone who became like a brother to them. It says llil boys because maybe the youngest daughter passed away, or just that Louis and Maurice are living with two other boys. It could be that. And once again, with boys, I mean, we were talking about grown men. They would be in their 30s now. And that those are zip codes from Sicily. Now, I'm just going to say one last thing. It's almost, we do have to entertain the possibility that people could follow news stories. I mean, people could just read up on this stuff even back in the 60s. I mean, we talked about the possibility of hoaxes. Is this Louis Sodder photograph, is this an absolute hoax? And that somebody just followed the story and they just wanted to make the family feel better by giving them some closure? So they just wrote they just wrote out a nonsensical message? I mean, I would entertain that possibility. We had that one person burying a beef liver on the family property, and then he was just like, hey, I found a body part. They took it to the coroner, and they're just like, this liver came from a cow, and it was also never in a fire. And that guy was just kind of doing it to give George Sodder some ideas. But I'm fully aware that people do just put out blatantly false information because they want to make people feel better. And we also talked about the bar incident in Texas, how that could be just an absolute, accident. It could be a hoax. It could be a guy got really drunk and started talking about something that he had read about in a newspaper one time. And, it's like, at the same time, though, I mean, I want to keep an open mind. And in this episode, I've really been exploring the possibility that Louis Sodder did survive the fire, and maybe even that Maurice survived, and that perhaps even there were 5 children that survived the fire, but for some reason, somehow, one of them passed away, and that could very well be Betty Sodder, the youngest, who would have been 6 at some time in between this. And last time, just recapping once more, the first line is Louis Sodder. That means that this is who he is in the photo. The second line, I love Brother Frankie, would probably be a guy they were staying with when they were in Italy. They're trying to say that Louis is now the third person in the group. It's the third something, but it's very possible that means Betty has passed away, and then that there are these zip codes in Sicily. It also, the zip codes, I mean, zip code, postal code from Sicily, that could be just telling the family where to look. That could be telling the family that you need to look here for your children, or like this is where, like, this is kind of the where you're going to find your answers. I'm not 100% sure what they would find, but I can say that there are postal codes for Sicily written on this thing. And if that isn't indicative of something, that's just a giant surprise to me. Well, thank you for listening to my very long, twisted, muddled, murky, and, all over the map rant about the Sodder children one more time, talking about the Louis Sodder photograph today. What do you think anything in that photograph could mean? Especially the third line, LLIL. What is that? Is that an accident? Is that like, a mistake? Or is that actually trying to communicate the message of pay attention to the third letter? What would you say about that? If you have anything to say at all, please talk, please challenge me, please write anything in the comments section below. If you want to say Black Box Radio, you sound like absolute nonsense, everything you say is wrong, tell me, because I want to get answers. And if I'm just going down, wild goose chase, let me know, so we can actually get to a deeper understanding of the case, and maybe we can actually get the real answers. That's only going to happen if we discuss this a little bit more. So thank you very much, and until next time.